We've probably all seen it happen, haven't we? Certain people in our workplaces who just seem incredibly good at climbing the ladder.
Hmm.
Today, we're going to dig into that a bit, looking at the ways some individuals gain power and, maybe more importantly, the damage they can actually do to the places they work.
Yeah, it's really about understanding some dynamics that, well, aren't always openly discussed in organizations. Our goal with this deep dive is to look closely at the tactics these people use, the sort of corruption that can follow, and what that means for the health and, the core principles of an organization.
And we're drawing on some detailed analysis of organizational corruption to guide us.
That's right. A pretty thorough examination.
Okay. So it should be, let's say, a thoughtful look at something quite serious, something maybe many of you listening have seen or felt. All right, so let's start at the beginning. How do these individuals, the ones you described as self-centered, maybe lacking empathy, how do they actually manage to gain power strategically?
Well, what's really striking is how deliberate it often is. The first step frequently is building this very charismatic, appealing image.
Right.
The analysis we looked at actually mentioned the rules of success from Psychopaths, talking about how they consciously craft this facade. They seem like ideal leaders at first.
So it's like a performance,
Yeah.
a charm offensive to pull people in.
Exactly, a very calculated one. And once they've built up a bit of that trust, they get quite good at spotting and then using the vulnerabilities or fears of people around them. And this isn't about, real connection. It's purely tactical. It's about strengthening their own position.
Right.
For instance, the analysis brought up the example of deliberately fostering competition between colleagues.
Oh, I see that.
Yeah, and it's not just about rivalry. It distracts people, sure, but it also creates this kind of scarcity mindset. People become less likely to work together or share things that could help everyone.
Because they're focused on themselves.
Exactly. And that reinforces the leader's role as the one who holds the keys, the gatekeeper.
That makes sense. It's subtle but effective. So controlling relationships, and then I assume information comes into play too.
Absolutely. Consolidating authority often involves managing the flow of information very carefully. They'll share things selectively, the details that make them look good or support their goals,
And hide the rest.
and deliberately hold back crucial information from others. Again, that rules of success. A source points this out, distorting or just hiding facts to gain an edge. It creates what's called information asymmetry. They just know more than anyone else, which gives them a huge advantage in, well, manipulating situations. Others can't get the full picture.
So controlling who knows what gives them the upper hand. And then there's the classic divide and rule strategy. That sounds particularly corrosive to a team.
Oh, it is. The analysis really highlights how they intentionally create friction, sow discord among employees. Pitting subordinates against each other is a prime example.
Why? To keep people weak.
Pretty much. It destroys trust and makes it almost impossible for any kind of unified opposition to form. Like the source material said, it's a key part of securing power. A divided workforce is just easier to manage, easier to control.
Grim, but makes a disturbing kind of sense. So once they've got this power, what happens to the organization? What are the signs of decay?
Yeah, this is where you start seeing the real long-term damage. The analysis lays out a few key indicators. Often there's this intense focus on short-term wins.
Quick results.
Quick results, yeah, with very little thought for the long game, for sustainability, ethics, often pushed aside if they get in the way of an immediate goal.
And accountability.
Blame shifting becomes routine. They're very good at deflecting responsibility for failures. And crucially, the underlying systemic problems in the organization, they just get ignored, festering away.
So it's like the foundations are being weakened from the inside out. Let's talk more about that ethical erosion. It sounds like it can happen surprisingly fast once this type of person is in charge.
It really does tend to be rapid. It's driven by their own self-interest, fundamentally. They lack that genuine concern for others or for the organization itself. So, yeah, the ethical bedrock starts cracking pretty much straight away.
And how does that show up first?
Well, the analysis points to transparency and integrity being early casualties. They start deliberately putting out inaccurate information, hyping up minor successes, hiding risks.
So not just holding back info, but actively misleading people.
Exactly.
Yep.
Actively creating a false picture. And that obviously screws up decision-making. Plus, they tend to just ignore established rules, regulations, even legal stuff, if it gets in their way.
Bypassing compliance.
If it serves their immediate purpose. And that sends a really strong signal, right? That the rules don't apply to them, which in turn can make other employees think, well, maybe they don't apply to me either. It kind of gives permission.
That's a really dangerous precedent. The idea that leadership actions basically lower the ethical bar for everyone.
It is. The analysis calls it normalization. Tolerating or even encouraging unethical stuff makes it seem normal. Maybe it starts small, overlooking minor rule bending.
Slippery slope.
Exactly. The example given was about ignoring small misuses of, say, expenses, which then grows into much bigger financial issues down the line.
So small compromises open the door to bigger ones. And how does this impact the actual employees, the people working under this kind of leader?
Well, they often play favorites, right? Promoting people who are loyal, who align with their agenda, while anyone who questions them or speaks out gets sidelined.
Or pushed out entirely?
Or pushed out, yeah. And this forces people into a tough spot. They have to choose between, doing the right thing ethically and just surviving in their job.
So ethics takes a backseat to survival.
Often, yes. And the whole organization gets dragged down. Morale plummets, motivation disappears. And long term, this disregard for ethics is a huge threat. Reputation damage, legal problems. It really jeopardizes the organization's future.
No kidding.
Yeah.
You can't build anything lasting on shaky ethical ground. Okay, let's switch gears slightly to another key tactic. Information control. Manipulating and hiding information. How does that work to keep them in power?
Oh, it's absolutely central. Controlling information is how they protect their own agenda and maintain authority, all while chipping away at transparency. Selective disclosure is huge, meaning they only share what makes them look good. They actively hide the negative stuff, the problems, the risks. It's like they create this curated reality inside the organization.
Like organizational gaslighting, making people doubt what they're seeing.
You could almost say that, yeah. The research mentioned in the analysis, McNabb and Dutton, talks about crafting this compelling image while hiding the bad stuff. So, suppressing reports of poor performance but shouting about one small success.
So no one gets an accurate picture of how things are really going.
Precisely. And they're masters at manipulating perspectives to shift blame. If a project fails, it's always someone else's fault, a subordinate, another department. Their role gets obscured.
And they use information to divide people, too.
Definitely. Intentionally keeping certain groups in the dark fosters isolation, maybe even conflict between teams. It stops people from banding together.
All adding up to less transparency.
Which leads to bad decisions. And as some research from the underground pointed out, it messes up governance, makes audits less effective. It basically creates the perfect conditions for corruption to thrive.
They might even actively sabotage oversight.
Absolutely. Falsifying data for audits, things like that. It's a systematic attack on accountability.
Wow. It's a really deliberate pattern of destructive behavior.
It is. And the more it happens, the more the organization just gets used to it. Unethical behavior becomes normal, internal ethics crumble, and the damage to the long-term reputation can be, well, devastating.
A truly vicious cycle.
Yeah.
Okay, let's face the unpleasant side of this fear. Using fear to control subordinates.
Yeah, fear becomes a really powerful tool for manipulation and, frankly, for accelerating corruption. You see a lot of harsh criticism, constant blame.
Making people afraid to make mistakes.
Exactly. Publicly calling people out for tiny errors. It creates this environment where everyone's walking on eggshells, terrified of doing something wrong.
That must kill creativity and initiative.
Completely. The analysis shows it stifles proactivity. People become so focused on just avoiding blame that they stop trying new things, stop taking any risks, even calculated ones.
Sounds incredibly draining.
It is. And they often prey on psychological vulnerabilities, too, trying to make people feel dependent on them, making their guidance seem absolutely essential.
Making themselves indispensable.
Right. There was an example of a leader who constantly picked fault, set employees against each other. The result: rock bottom morale, terrible performance. It's a classic toxic dynamic.
And the information control feeds into this fear.
For sure. By keeping people in the dark, they force reliance on the leader for direction. It undermines efficiency, autonomy, everything. And fear makes people hide the truth, right?
Yeah, you wouldn't report a mistake if you thought you'd be crucified for it.
Exactly. So transparency breaks down completely. Problems don't get solved because no one dares admit they exist. Ultimately, this climate of fear just crushes innovation and leads to burnout and high turnover. People just can't sustain it.
It's a recipe for a profoundly unhealthy place to work. So let's try to define this corrupt leadership more clearly. What are its core features?
Well, at its heart, it's about prioritizing short-term personal gain. That's the driving force. Ethics are secondary, maybe irrelevant, and there's a real block on any genuine long-term thinking for the organization.
Self-interest, above all.
Pretty much. That analysis from the underground really emphasizes the self-centered decision-making. It's all about consolidating their own power, not about what's actually good for the company.
Can you give examples?
Sure, things like aggressive cost-cutting, maybe sudden layoffs to boost short-term numbers, even if it guts R&D or training things the company needs to compete in the future, it's incredibly short-sighted.
Sacrificing the future for today's personal win.
That's a good way to put it. And transparency, as we've said, gets destroyed. Information is manipulated to deceive. The underground also talks about reinforcing control through fear, manipulation, stoking competition, breaking down trust. It's all part of the pattern.
And the ethical decline.
Yeah, ignoring compliance, bending rules, sometimes outright fraud, all for personal benefit. And the underground notes how this trickles down. Employees start to copy the bad behavior.
Leading to.
Predictably, massive trust issues internally, terrible morale, people leaving in droves. It makes any kind of long-term success incredibly difficult, if not impossible.
It really sounds like it corrodes the organization from the core outwards. Now, you mentioned something called the expansion of moral hazard. How does this type of leadership fuel that?
Right. Moral hazard expands when leaders put their own interests first, basically sending the message that unethical behavior is okay, maybe even the way to get ahead.
So leadership sets the tone.
Exactly. When leaders themselves are, say, fudging the numbers, misusing company funds, and nothing happens, it just erodes the standards for everyone. People see it.
And they might start thinking.
Well, if the boss can get away with it, maybe I can too. They might start inflating their own results for a bonus or, cutting corners elsewhere for personal gain.
It becomes contagious.
Very much so. And these leaders are often good at manipulating the internal checks and balances to cover their tracks, which lets this moral hazard get really embedded. Add in the fear factor pressure to go along with unethical requests.
Like being told to falsify a report.
Yeah, that kind of thing. It just makes it worse. The whole culture shifts. Responsibility fades, trust evaporates, internal competition heats up. It damages cohesion, performance, everything.
And this must have external consequences too.
Absolutely. When this stuff inevitably leaks out or becomes public, the reputational hit can be enormous. Loss of customer trust, regulatory investigations, it can be really severe.
A cascade effect, starting from the top. Okay, one particularly nasty tactic is dealing with whistleblowers. Why are they seen as such a danger by these leaders?
Whistleblowers are a direct threat because they expose the truth. They shine a light on the unethical stuff, the misconduct. For a leader whose power relies on secrecy and manipulation, someone revealing that is, well, it's a huge problem.
So they have to be silenced.
That's the goal. They actively try to suppress or get rid of them to keep their control. The analysis lists ways they do it, attacking their credibility publicly, painting them as disloyal traitors, harassment, retaliation.
Making an example of them.
Exactly. The example given of publicly trashing an employee who reported financial wrongdoing that sends a powerful message to everyone else. Keep your mouth shut.
Creates a real chilling effect.
Totally. It builds that culture of fear and mistrust we talked about. It stops others from reporting problems. So fraud, harassment, whatever it is, just carries on unchecked. It becomes systemic.
And it damages transparency overall.
Fundamentally, whistleblowers are often a key accountability mechanism. Getting rid of them cripples that. Plus, punishing people for doing the right thing. It kills morale. It tells everyone ethics don't matter here.
There was a case study mentioned.
Yeah, where a whistleblower was discredited, forced out, and the corruption just got worse, eventually leading to massive legal and reputational fallout for the company. It really shows how vital it is to protect people who speak up.
A stark warning.
Yeah.
It highlights how vulnerable ethical people can be in these situations. Okay, let's zoom out again. The analysis talks about corruption's chain reaction. How does the bad behavior of a few manage to spread and almost paralyze the whole organization?
Yeah, it's not just isolated incidents. The actions at the top trigger this ripple effect. It starts with power being enforced downwards. Self-serving decisions erode ethics at the leadership level, which implicitly encourages similar behavior lower down.
Monkey see, monkey do.
To an extent, yes, but also through active manipulation, forcing people to comply with unethical stuff, pushing out dissenters. Corruption spreads from the top, and eventually, middle managers, frontline staff, they either give in to the pressure or start copying the behavior they see being rewarded.
So individual judgment gets overridden.
It gets paralyzed, yeah. Especially in really hierarchical places where leaders have a lot of direct power over subordinates, it's a clear domino effect.
And moral hazard plays a role here too.
A huge role. As unethical actions become tolerated, they seem more acceptable, which just speeds up the spread. And as corruption takes hold, the organization just stops functioning properly.
How so?
Transparency is gone, decisions are faulty, everyone's focused on short-term survival or gain, teamwork, collaboration. That breaks down because of all the division and competition they've fostered. It becomes incredibly inefficient.
And the external risks mount.
Definitely. As the internal problems get worse, the chances of them becoming public knowledge increase, damaged reputation, regulatory trouble. It's almost inevitable.
A disturbing picture of systemic collapse.
Yeah.
And this internal rot, it doesn't just stay inside, does it? It leaks out, eroding trust with external stakeholders too.
Oh, absolutely. That internal corruption inevitably damages trust with customers, partners, investors, everyone. When internal standards collapse, when transparency disappears, you start seeing deceptive practices externally.
Like what?
Fraudulent financial reports, maybe manipulated product data, things that eventually come to light. And when misconduct gets exposed, say, a defective product hits the market because quality control was ignored to save money, customer trust just evaporates.
And rebuilding that trust must be incredibly hard.
It's extremely difficult and costly. It's not just about one mistake. It taints the whole perception of the company.
It's a fundamental breach of faith.
Exactly. The analysis mentioned a case, a corporation cooking the books, looked successful for a while, but a whistleblower exposed it. Stock price tanked, investors fled, partners lost faith. Shows how leadership focused only on short-term gain can ruin long-term viability.
And partnerships suffer too.
Oh, yeah. Unethical behavior in partnerships, unilaterally changing contracts, hiding profits destroys that trust, making future collaboration impossible. And internal issues like harassment scandals or poor working conditions if they get out, that also destroys external trust.
So the damage radiates outwards, affecting every relationship the organization has. Okay, finally, let's talk recovery. How does an organization even begin to address this level of corruption? It sounds like a massive challenge.
It is a huge undertaking. It needs a really comprehensive, sustained effort. You need to rebuild leadership and you need to rebuild transparency.
Where do you even start?
The analysis is clear. Step one has to be removing the corrupt leaders. You need new leadership, ethical leadership, committed to transparency and trust. That sets the new tone.
Okay, new leaders in place.
And what?
Then thorough internal investigations. You have to dig deep, find the root causes. Was it financial misconduct, operational failures, ethical blind spots, and hold people accountable? It's like an organizational post-mortem. You need to be honest about what went wrong.
A painful but necessary step. Absolutely. Then you need systems for transparency. Clearer decision-making processes, much stronger audits, internal and maybe external too, better information sharing. Everyone needs to see what's going on.
And retraining people.
Definitely. Ethics and compliance training is vital. You have to reestablish the guidelines, push back against that normalization of bad behavior, and crucially, protect whistleblowers.
We saw how important that is.
Essential. Robust systems, anonymous reporting, confidentiality guarantees so people feel safe speaking up if things start going wrong again.
What about the workforce generally? Morale must be shattered.
Rebuilding trust and morale is key. Creating a safe, supportive environment, maybe increasing employee involvement in decisions, and looking long-term, you have to rethink how leaders are chosen. Put way more emphasis on ethical character, find ways to stop power getting concentrated in the wrong hands.
Maybe bring in outside help sometimes.
Yeah, periodic organizational health checks by external consultants can spot problems that people inside might miss. It's a whole package.
So it really is a top-to-bottom overhaul, demanding serious long-term commitment to rebuilding that culture of integrity.
That's exactly it. Rebuilding the foundations based on ethics, transparency, and accountability.
Okay. So wrapping up this deep dive, we've really traced the path, haven't we? From the calculated rise of certain individuals through the ways they systematically foster corruption, right up to the devastating impact on an organization's integrity and the trust it depends on inside and out. Hopefully, for you listening, this gives a clearer picture of these destructive patterns that unfortunately do play out in the working world. And, thinking about the bigger picture, it's worth remembering how these toxic environments where self-interest trumps ethics often result in good people leaving, not just moving on, but being pushed out by the negativity.
Which really brings us to a final thought for you to consider. Think about your own influence, however big or small. What can you do to help build or support spaces where integrity isn't just a buzzword, but how things are actually done, where ethical behavior is the norm? Because fostering those kinds of environments is how we can make sure our positive traits, our ethical grounding, become strengths, and how we guard against this kind of organizational decay taking root.